Good morning. Good morning, Mike DeMar. We got good morning from in the Q&A. I'm just going to give it one more minute. For those of you here, my name is Andrea Burton. I'm a design advocate at Abstract. We have Allison Shaw, design systems at Zendesk. I'm going to give it one more minute just to let, I see more attendees rolling in, and then we'll get going. For everybody who's here, we have questions that came from the last webinar, and we're going to start with those questions. If you do have questions, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A, and we'll leave some time at the end to answer some of those. All right, so I was waiting for a specific number of attendees. We just hit that, so let's get started. Great. So I just did a quick intro, but I'll do it again for the new people in the webinar. Welcome to Design Systems Q&A with Zendesk's Allison Shaw. I'm Andrea Burton. I'm a design advocate at Abstract. I'm a Southern transplant. I'm from North Carolina originally. I lived in Portland, Oregon. I'm now in Minneapolis. I'm a design systems nerd. I love to nerd out about design workflow. I did work previously at Target in design ops. And then let's welcome Allison Shaw. Allison, welcome to the webinar today. Let me just do your intro really quickly. Allison is a senior design manager at Zendesk for the design system team. Allison has been working on design systems since 2013. At Zendesk, her team works to make the Garden design system a best-in-class product that powers the application suite and serves as the open source, accessible foundation for outside organizations. So it's so good to have you back, Allison. Welcome.
Thank you for having me back. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so we're gonna continue with some questions we had about Garden. I'm actually gonna stop sharing my screen because this is gonna be more conversational. So I'm gonna stop sharing and yeah, let's jump in.
That's good.
Yeah, cool. All right, so just starting from some questions that we had the last time. Let's just jump into, you're at a company and you have legacy components. You have a UI that's already built. What approach, what advice would you give in order to get a design system started and how to refactor those existing assets?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, it's always a good idea to try and push forward with these sorts of centralization efforts. Being able to take work that's already been done and leverage that in more places, I think is really always a win, not just for the design consistency angle, but also for code cleanliness and stuff like that. So the way that I tend to approach these sorts of things is the way that we would approach any kind of design system, right? Make sure that you're auditing what you already have. Make sure that you have a set, kind of criteria for the standards that you want your new components to meet. And then just leverage as much as already there. The more that you can kind of be working yourselves into people's existing workflows rather than creating a new process or a new tool, all the better. But definitely having a centralized approach usually will lead to wins down the road.
Ah, that's great advice. When you talk about an audit, do you guys have a specific audit process you've used at Zendesk or other places that you've worked?
Yeah, at Zendesk, we have a lot of products that we support. And so just having one person do an audit is really not super effective because they don't know all of the different little nooks and crannies of all the products. Yeah. So we actually involve our entire design team. When we're taking on the design and development of a new component, one of the very first things that we do is let our designers know and our engineers know, hey, we're taking this on. If you have examples in your own products, could you please send those our way so we can take a look and understand, what are their requirements that they have. And in fact, we're taking on the design of a really new and big component right now. And we're actually going in and interviewing engineering teams that have built these kind of one-off solutions in the past, so we can understand what are their requirements and how can we build something that kind of has a baseline of usability across the entire organization.
Oh, cool. So you're getting some good collaboration with the developers and the developer teams.
Yep.
Right on. Let's jump into how you deal with one-off solutions and designs, which, you do have to really talk to developers about that because they might have to build this. Do you have a rule in place for when an element in the UI becomes a pattern or a component? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So at Zendesk, we kind of exercise a bit of restraint. We won't introduce anything into the design system unless we know that it can be immediately used in at least 2 of our products.
Yeah.
The reality, of course, is that one-offs sometimes are really necessary. When you're inventing new ways of working, of course, you're going to need to invent new user interface elements to support that. But I think, the main factor in is something worth centralizing, and is it worth kind of abstracting out away from that very specific use case, comes down to, is this something that we believe can be used immediately in other places?
Yeah.
And I think that's a good approach to it. You know, a lot of the one-off stuff that I see tends to be around onboarding.
Mm-hmm.
And I also kind of always stress to the designers and critiques and stuff like that, right? That leveraging existing patterns is actually, it's better for the user because they understand how something works, right? Like, how many wizards does
Right.
the world need to have?
Yep.
But it's also better for being able to more rigorously conduct usability studies, conduct A/B testing to see what is helping convert better.
Yep.
The more that you can keep the same and the fewer variables you can introduce, kind of the more you're able to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Um, yeah. Cool. Let's jump into the next question. When you do release a component or put into use the design system, do you wait until it's completely ready? Do you do partial releases? And how do you test those releases?
Yeah. So I think it's important to treat design systems as products. And of course, there's going to be a minimum level of usefulness that a product can have that you need to hit before you release it out to the public. But I'm of the mind that as soon as you hit that point of usefulness, you should be releasing the work, because the sooner you can release it, the sooner you're helping other teammates do their work.
Yeah.
But you can also learn from it through testing, through metric tracking, stuff like that. I think, the idea of doing stepped releases and incremental releases is really smart for a design system. And for people who are just kind of getting started, right? Like, I take the example of a button, which seems like it's so small. Is it even worth, saying, oh, we have a design system now because we have
Yeah.
a button? But the truth is that if you do a button correctly, if you design it correctly, and if you engineer it correctly, there's so much that can go into just like one little tiny button, that if the rest of the team is constantly having to recreate that button or redevelop that button, how many times does that take? Even if, if it's just an hour to develop a proper button, right?
Yeah.
Like, the network effects of getting that out into the world faster are just kind of, to me, it's just a no-brainer in terms of like efficiencies and consistency for the user.
Yeah, I was just I was just talking to another colleague of mine who's very into design systems, and we were talking about just all of the different states that a button could have. And so if we're building that out over and over again, you're just taking so much time to be like, what is the disabled state of this look like on a specific platform? And it's like, if we just build that out once, there's so many things we can focus in on.
Yeah.
Which I'm going to jump to a question that I know comes up a lot for teams working in design system teams. So, and this question came up in our Q&A, does a design system make a UI designer redundant in a company?
No, 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 no. I think this is a really common question to get, and I think it's really important to understand like where that fear comes from, because we all, you know, especially in times like this, right? We want to make sure that we're doing a good job and that we're actively contributing to the places that we work for. But the way that I really think we should look at design systems is these are just another tool to help you do your job in a better, more consistent, more accessible, more localizable kind of way, right?
Yeah.
And so the less time that a designer has to spend on putting some text into a rectangle, the more time they can spend on the actual problems that are facing their users.
Yeah.
It is so much more valuable to have a product designer focus on the end-to-end flow and not worry too deeply about the minuscule details of the UI, and kind of have a team or designers who have time set aside to specifically focus on that.
Yeah.
It's yeah, the design system is a tool. It's like Sketch, it's like Abstract.
Yeah.
And we have to think of them in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. When this question comes up to me, I'm like, we get to stop redesigning buttons over and over again, or cards or modals or all those things. Like if we just define those, think of all the other things we can design. Think of all the other problems we can really dig into, and figuring out like, how does this person use this app from, you know, touch point A, B, C, D, E. So let's see. Let's jump back into kind of like how the garden team uses abstract, but also in versioning, not necessarily version control of files, but versioning of design systems.
Yeah.
How do you, like, do you guys have different versions of Garden? And do you ever have different teams that need to use those different versions of the sketch files? How does that work within Zendesk?
So the single source of truth that Garden always refers to is the code version.
Gotcha.
The team, obviously we're open source. All of our components are available through GitHub, through NPM, and all of the different versions that we release are available basically in perpetuity, right? For as long
Yeah.
as NPM is around.
Yep.
And so any development team that's using, we're on version 8 right now, and say a team is still on version 6, they're still able to use and leverage that code. On the design side, we kind of really strongly encourage people to just stay up to date with the latest in the design system. And of course, you know, with Abstract, it's really easy for a designer to decide if they want to pull in changes or not.
Yep.
But for us, we want people to be comfortable with the evolution of the UI over time.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they can't have that directly reflected in their engineering output right away, it's still an important part of any kind of product development process to go back and making sure that you're upgrading to the latest versions of the technology that you're on.
Yeah.
And so we kind of let design be the leader there, and have engineering say like, okay, like that's a new thing. We need to make sure that we're upgrading to Garden
Yeah.
V8 or whatever it is, so that they can take advantage of it.
Oh, cool. That makes sense. The next question is, do you use semantic versioning for design updates? And I guess you kind of just answered this, like how do you communicate and work with the developers? Like, can we go into that a little bit more? So the designer owns the design, but the latest source of truth is in the code. You know, if a designer is like, let's say they did a one-off and then the entire team decided, okay, this needs to be a component that we're going to build, and you know, does that start in the sketch files, and how do you work with the developers on developing that out?
Yeah. So oftentimes, if we've got like a brand new pattern that's coming into us, it's something that a designer on a product team has done already.
Yeah.
And so, we're able to, everything's in abstract. So we're able to kind of go in and understand the way that they intended to work. And then it's the design systems team's job to abstract that out. So of course, if you're working on a particular flow and say that you want to introduce like a new side panel
Yeah.
to show detailed information, right? The way that that's going to be designed for the product is everything's going to be kind of built into it, right? There's going to be some heading information, there's probably some detail information, everything's kind of like all part and parcel to that within their files. And so the design systems team's job is to go in there and say like, okay, like at the, if we boil this down to the very, bones of the thing, what makes this special and different,
Yeah.
such that it belongs into the design system?
Yeah.
And so then we bring it in, and we have we have like a little like emoji naming schema for our branches inside the garden libraries project on abstract. We have a little island for when we're doing explorations. When we move into, okay, this is something that's been vetted, it's definitely going to be added, we change that icon over to the heavy plus sign.
Yeah.
So that we can kind of track, okay, what's the status of all of these different things? And the engineers are taking part in this design process from the beginning. They're with us in abstract. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. I want to just pull this up to show the like how people use emojis within your branch names, right?
Yep.
Just to show like what you're actually working on.
Yeah. And those let us, kind of search and go back for things later, because you can just search for that emoji and it'll bring up all of the emojis, all the branches rather, that like have a bug in there. So you can look back and say like, okay, like we fixed that bug on this date.
Yeah.
And it's like a little bit of joy, but it's really helpful, and it just makes things a lot more scannable for us.
Yeah, I know. I love an abstract because you can search literally by an emoji. And so we also use the island. We use a few different ones, but it's the pencil we use a lot for copy edits. So it's nice to be able to just like in the quick jump, you can search using that emoji. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Cool. Let's see. Let's jump into, and this is another hot topic in design systems, but metrics and how we measure the effectiveness of design systems. The question is, I was wondering what you'd think are the critical success factors in creating a successful design system and design library.
Yeah. So I agree. Metrics is one of those like really kind of hot button issues right now. I think, there's a real tendency to want to get kind of caught up in what I kind of call vanity metrics of like, how many times has this code been imported into the code base, or how many clicks is a button getting? And those are things that are relatively easy to measure. But when you think about the purpose of a design system, it's to make people's jobs easier. And so the real metric or measurement that you want to go after is, how satisfied are people with the design system? Do they think of it positively? Do they think of it negatively? And how much time do they believe it's either costing them or saving them? And the more time that it's costing them, then obviously there's a lot of work to do to make it more usable, more understandable, more robust. But if it's saving them a lot of time, then you're on the right track, and you can kind of keep doing the same things that you're doing. I think that a lot of it comes down to, what is the user-centered metric that you want to track against, and those are the ones that we've chosen.
Yep. That totally makes sense. Um, how do you, that kind of touches on like, how do you communicate out with your stakeholders and your users of the design system? How do you communicate changes that happen over time? Um, what are your communication methods, and how do you involve other stakeholders?
Yeah, 100%. So we have a number of ways that we keep in touch with the design and developer community within Zendesk. And then of course we have the public facing aspects as well because we're open source. But within Zendesk, we hold office hours every other week. And we have a Slack channel that's centered on developers and a Slack channel that's centered on designers. And those are, we call them safe spaces for people to come and ask questions that they
Yeah,
have around, are they using this correctly? Did they find a bug? That sort of thing. We also, in those office hours, we are doing proactive communication with our design team to let them know what we're working on, to request their feedback, to request
yeah,
their help in audits. And I think it's a really interesting time that we're in with COVID and travel restrictions. But one of the really important things is forming, working relationships with the people that you're building this tool for. And in the same way that a designer wants to go out and interview customers, we want to be going out and forming relationships and doing research with our designers and our developers. So back in the day before March, right?
yeah,
We were very privileged to be able to travel to our different offices and do lunch and learns and do sit down sessions with pretty much all of our stakeholders within the company. And that sort of
yeah,
thing is super important, whether you're a company like Zendesk that has, offices all over the world and designers in all of those offices, or if you're just getting started, maintaining that really close relationship with the people that you're building for is essential.
yeah. Um, that's great. And I think we're just going to keep getting more and more creative during this time. It'll be interesting to see the different ways we collaborate together.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to jump to a question from the Q&A because it kind of deals with versioning, but also like communicating out to stakeholders. Do you have a process for deprecating items from the design system?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's something that I think once you've had a design system for longer than 6 months, you need to grapple with.
Yeah,
Um, so with the code, it's really quite straightforward, right? If we make a breaking change, we're going to be announcing that it'll be a major version bump, and we will, during those big breaking changes, kind of announce, okay, this is deprecated or this has made a significant change, and when you upgrade, you should expect these things.
yeah,
Um, with the design angle, we do a very similar kind of communication. Although most of the evolutions of our design system are evolutions, not removals. It's
yeah,
very rare for us to just be like, you know what, that's out.
yeah,
Um, we can make strong recommendations that people avoid certain kinds of UI, but in general, we're there to help enable people, and we try not to. We're very opinionated about user experience, but if
yeah.
someone is like, "Look, I have to do it," um, we want to be there for them as much as possible.
Cool. I'm going to go to another question in the Q&A because you kind of touched a little bit on this. Uh, any advice on managing conflict on a design system team? Like maybe there's a disagreement. The example
Yeah.
the question asker asks is, for example, a component comes into question or is challenged in a new way. Do you recommend a voting system, final decision maker when choosing a direction or adding to a system?
That's a really great question. I
Yeah, I
think
agree.
very, very astute. Design
Yeah,
systems are all about people, right? So
yep,
if you're going to have people involved, you're going to have conflict. I think it is important to not do design by committee as much as possible. I think it's important to base decisions about what is good and what is, you know, right for the system on user research as often as possible. The design systems, if it's a team or if it's just a you know, a group of folks who are doing this because they believe in it, working with the rest of the feature teams to get research questions that are oriented around the UI into their research studies is really important.
Yeah.
But once you have those inputs, a lot of it does come down to, we need to have a single, you know, decision maker, and there needs to be accountability to that decision. It can't just be like, oh, the design system did this, but I don't like it, so I'm going to do this other thing.
Yep.
And of course, you know, are there always exceptions? Yes, there's always exceptions. There's always going to be the need to kind of push the limit of an element or create a one-off sometimes. But having robust discussion, having those discussions be based in research, really kind of reduces the conflict between team members, because it really comes down to, we can make a decision on behalf of the user.
Cool. Sorry for the barking interruption, the whole work at home with the dog.
Totally.
I have a few questions that just came up from your answer. So are you, do you have a researcher that works on the design system team, or do you guys all do your own research? Just curious.
We don't have, we do not have a researcher who specifically design, like, you know, assigned to the design system. As I was saying with a little bit earlier in that answer, where you do need to kind of piggyback on other people's research studies.
Yeah.
I think it's really difficult to like individually and in a vacuum test a piece of user interface, right?
Yeah.
Because if you build a button to standard, it works the way that it should. What it comes down to is, does it work in the workflow that someone actually has to carry out? And that's where the context is so important. And that's why it's so important to have these things tested in the context of a product.
Yeah.
I had a friend on the research team actually say, like, user interface components are like a really nice black t-shirt. It's a nice black t-shirt. It's going to be useful in a lot of scenarios, but you still wouldn't wear it to a wedding, right? And so having that context around the UI and understanding how the UI performs in that context is really the more important thing to be looking at.
Ah, that's really insightful. I love that. Let's jump back into, I'll jump into this one last question I have, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. So I work with a lot of teams, design system teams, and this question comes up a lot around, you have one screen that is touched by multiple teams or multiple projects. When I was at Target, it was the product detail page. That could have had 10 to 12 different product teams touching that. Do you guys have that use case at Zendesk, and how do you deal with that within your sketch files and libraries and setups?
Yeah, I think this is a scenario that the technical solutions are still really evolving for. Certainly, you know, in a product like Zendesk, we absolutely have a couple of very key screens that get touched by a lot of different teams. I think, you know, there's an important difference between the design system, which is Garden and kind of provides all of the atomic level pieces of user interface, and then things that are more like product specific libraries that are, you know, groups of components that belong together. And I think that both having, you know, a more universal design system as well as supplemental libraries, depending on your product area, does make a lot of sense. I think in terms of, in your example of like distributing an item detail page, um, one of the approaches that I've seen is just make a symbol out of that whole page, and people can kind of bring it in and into their workflows, and at least they'll have that as a starting point. But I think it's still messy, right? Because if you need to alter that page, which is probably your job, not only are you going to have to do that work in whatever area of a project you're working on, but it does need to go back into that supplemental library. And I think we have a little bit more to do in terms of the reusability of these design assets.
Yeah, I agree with you too. And I think tooling, abstract as a tool also, that's it's a problem that we really want to look into. Like, how do you duplicate the efforts, but also have that source of truth, and detaching from symbol and that kind of stuff. I remember a question I had before, talking about the research and understanding who the users are of the design system, specifically with Zendesk.
Yeah.
You have your Zendesk internal users, right? But then since it's open source, you have a whole other group of users.
Yep.
Do you treat them differently because they have different use cases? Are you mostly focusing on the Zendesk users? Because are the open source users, are they building Zendesk themes and that kind of stuff, or are they just using Garden in their own projects that have nothing to do with Zendesk?
So the open source community uses Zendesk in a variety of ways. We do have people who are developing apps for Zendesk. We have a platform where you can have apps in, right? And so they're using the UI so that their apps look native. But then we also have users who, have nothing to do with Zendesk or customer support software at all, and they're using some of our components as the basis for their system. Most of those users are consuming our React containers, which don't have visible UI. They're just code layers that have interaction, accessibility, and localization features built in, so that you can kind of start off with, just say it's like a button. You can start off with like, okay, the button has this kind of ARIA label, and we know that it's kind of controlling these sorts of things. And it has all of the focus state, statefulness, and what it is waiting for is the visual UI treatment from that team's designer. So in general, we are, we're built for Zendesk, and we certainly are going to be taking most of our feature requests internally. But we have had a number of requests from the broader community where we looked at and said, that's, like, why don't we have that? And that is something that we could provide. And so it becomes like a really nice virtuous circle in that way.
Cool. I love that. Great. I'm going to move. We got about 10 more minutes. I'm going to move to the Q&A, and we'll just go through the different questions. What's your approach? This is a good question. It comes up a lot. What's your approach for keeping your design system in sync with dev production, like dev, how they're coding it?
Yeah. So really, really so important for designers and developers to be collaborating on these things really at the very beginning stages of the design process. If there are technical requirements that we need to hit, if there are accessibility concerns that we need to be aware of, the developers are going to have that information. And so the more that we can kind of be talking and collaborating early on, the more likely we are to have something in the end that can be, just implemented kind of as is to spec or whatever. Garden design holds back all of our branches until it's live in code. So for example, we were designing a date picker, and the development portion of that date picker took a while, not terribly long. They were doing it kind of as they went, but it does take a little bit longer to make sure that all of the accessibility is right. I think we had some other stuff that came up that slowed them down or whatever. And so we didn't merge our component branch into our master until that component was actually released. And so that's how we keep things together. There's, I think it's probably not worth the effort to try and make sure that every little thing in the design system is 100% equal on both sides. There's always going to be something that you miss, and it's better to just not have that be a goal. As long as you're clear about which one is the source of truth. And that's why we always say the thing that's actually going to show up on somebody's computer when they're trying to use Zendesk, that's the source of truth.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. And it's, what I've seen in working within abstract is like, yeah, hard, fast rules, like just really defined rules. You need to be a little bit more fluid. The abstract team, the design team, they don't merge anything in abstract until it's built into production. And we found that just really helps with the workflow, with the collections, the links, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump into how do you go about development handoff of design system components? More specifically, I noticed that Garden shows many different states, sizes, types, etc. But what about the anatomy, principles, use cases, do's and don'ts of components? Do you have a separate website?
Yeah, we do have a separate website. We have a documentation site, garden.zendesk.com, and that's kind of where in code all of those things are living. In terms of like a handoff process, to be honest with you, I really don't like the term handoff. I think it implies a beginning and an end that in reality doesn't exist. I talked a lot about, just before, it's really important for designers and developers to be talking early on to make sure that the designs that are happening are possible in code within, all of the requirements of a browser, all of that. And to kind of have an official handoff, it's best not to.
Yeah.
Because if you have that and it's like, okay, just develop all the stuff that's in this one collection or this one document, things will get missed, and people it's kind of a breeding ground for conflict, right? Because if the developer says like, well, it said it was this way in the document, but now you're telling me that's wrong. Now I have to go back and my whole schedule's thrown off. And it's just like, no, we're on the same team. We're building the same things. We're just building them in different phases.
Yeah.
So I like to avoid that as much as possible.
Yeah, the word handoff, it's just, I don't like it either. And, in working with devs, I do really love that collaboration where we're just like, we're here together. I want it to be like what it needs to be for the designers to design, but also so that it speaks the same language as what the engineers are going to understand.
Yeah. And I think that there's such a great partnership there. Because designers, I think it's a really easy tendency for us to be like, okay, like I can only imagine this thing happening in this one specific way, and I don't want to support any other use cases, and I'm gonna, it has to be this width or this height or whatever. And the truth is when you're designing a system that needs to be universal and flexible, you can't put any of those kinds of restrictions onto the design work. And so the developer is really important in helping you understand what actually are the constraints that you're working in, not the ones that you think you're designing to. What are the actual constraints?
Yeah.
So it has to be a partnership, because in the end, the end user is the real consumer of these things, right? Yep. It's not just, oh, I'm making this for a designer, or I'm making this for a developer. They're going to use it, but in service of this other much larger audience.
Yeah, I love that point. That really brings it all together. And that touches on a point that this question, at Target, we had an amazing accessibility team. I learned so much from them, and I really hadn't worked at a company that had put so much energy into accessibility. How do you guys deal with accessibility at Zendesk and on Garden? Are you doing voiceover, keyboard navigation? You know, you've talked about the ARIA labels, and
Yeah.
talk to me about accessibility.
Yeah, accessibility is really one of the kind of founding pillars of Garden. We consider it certainly from the very beginning in the design process, but we have a strong focus on it on the development side as well. Um, Accessibility is a really kind of difficult facet of product development in software. It's becoming increasingly important, but people aren't educated about it. And so having an accessible design system is really important because you give the rest of the product a good baseline to kind of build up from. So we are certainly focused on making sure that our ARIA systems are correct, that they're behaving in the ways that are expected and standard. We use semantic structure whenever possible so that the screen readers can, utilize, oh, okay, like that's the nav area and this is the content area. All of that is kind of foundational. And when I talked earlier about the React containers, all of that accessibility feature, all of the internationalization features, so right to left toggling, all of that gets built into the very foundational part of the code element.
That's awesome. Well, we only have 1 minute left, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I just want to say to everybody, like, I'm in Minneapolis, you're in San Francisco, everybody's probably in a place where things are very transformative. So I just want to say, send care and, just to acknowledge that. The other thing I want to say before we close up is Abstract. We have put out a design system ebook, and I'm trying to find the right page to share it with you guys. Check it out. It's called Tame the Chaos. I'm going to share my screen really quickly, just so you can see what it looks like. Tame the Chaos, design systems from definition to distribution. We interviewed a lot of our different customers. Allison has a quote in there, I believe. So check it out. You can download it from our website. And other than that, Allison, thank you so much for joining us again today. Always a pleasure to talk with you. And, for the questions we didn't get to, we'll probably just create another web page. We'll answer them. At some point, we will answer all your questions. So yeah, thanks so much. And have a good day, everyone. Take care.
Awesome. Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.